Welcome to Aviation Week's Friday webinar. I'm Joe Anselmo, Editorial Director. Airbus is faring better than rival Boeing, but it still faces some momentous challenges. With demand for new airplanes decimated by the COVID-19 crisis, how deeply will Airbus have to cut production? And how can it do so without killing off key suppliers? Meanwhile, European governments are now mandating development of a clean airliner by 2035. With such challenges, though, come opportunities. Among them, can Airbus leverage the phenomenal market success of the A321neo to gain a long-term advantage over rival Boeing in the single-aisle market? Joining me to make sense of all of this are Aviation Week Executive Editor Jens Flotow, who has just returned from Toulouse, where he interviewed the Airbus CEO, France Bureau Chief Thierry Dubois, who joins us from London, and our early riser in California, Senior Editor Guy Norris. Thanks for getting up and joining us, Guy. What's going on in Toulouse?
Well, Joe, as you know, I'm usually in Toulouse once or twice a month for Airbus meetings, events. Because of COVID-19, I had a 3-month break until last week.
Yes, we seem to be having some technical difficulties with you. Do you want to maybe shut off your video and see if the audio works?
Quite a special visit. The first night we went out with many Airbus people to a little.
Okay.
Okay, trying again without the video. I hope this is better for all. Maybe you can give me a hint whether that works. Is that working?
Well, yeah. Well, welcome to the age of video conference.
So I'm trying again. So as I said, I am in Toulouse once or twice a month for meetings usually, and there was a big break now because of COVID-19. But the visit was really special this time for several reasons, and I'll explain why. First of all, we visited a little town called Levignac to watch the last A380 convoy of fuselage sections come through, and it's hard to imagine that this will never happen again, right? So Airbus CEO Guillaume Faury was there, the Philippe Main, the head of programs, many Airbus employees. It was very emotional for them, lots of tears, and witnessing that such a historic milestone was really something special. Then I did have a chance to talk to Faury about the current situation, about the plans, and you'll all have a chance to read this in an interview that we're publishing very soon in Aviation Week. My impression was that they are really trying to take a very analytical approach to questions like production rates, considering what is the maximum the airlines and the lessors will take, and what is the minimum the supply chain can reach without, catastrophic failures, and what is Airbus' red line as they build up inventory. And so speaking of inventory, I did spend a day or two in the delivery center to watch Lufthansa people go through the process of accepting an A350 that they could no longer defer. And frankly, you see lots of aircraft that are parked and stored with or without engines. I saw 3 Qatar Airways A350-1000s there and reminded myself that Akbar al-Bakr just said that he doesn't want to take any aircraft for a long time. There were other aircraft, Air France, Iberia, all of which have deferred deliveries. So in a way, it felt like business as usual, but then again, obviously you knew what was going on in the industry. All of these ingredients of my visit kind of summarize the situation. A program ends, A380, obviously not because of COVID. Then you see the crisis management exercise, dealing with the uncertainty, which is a huge challenge, and trying to plan for the future to retain some level of normalcy. One final point on production rates before I hand back to you. A lot of people have argued that rates will have to come down further below rate 40 on the narrow-body side, but Airbus really seems to be keen to push out these aircraft, mainly to protect the supply chain. And there's a sense of you still need to invest into technology big time in spite of everything. And maybe Thierry can talk about that a little more.
Okay, well, when Jens says rate 40, he's referring to the monthly production of A320s. It's sort of hard to believe when we began this year. There were some people envisioning a day when Airbus would go up to 70 A320s a month, and now we're saying 40 may be too many. Thierry, you reported on some news, recent news out of France. The French government has passed an aerospace research package, some activity in Germany too. And part of that, they're demanding that Airbus develop a clean airliner by 2035. Do you want to fill us in on the details?
Yeah, sure. So first of all, good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Joining you from Lyon, not London. Joining you from Lyon, France. And yes, the French government package has, let's say, two highlights. One of them is to support the entire industry, especially the supply chain, and it sort of forces industry solidarity. So in addition to Airbus not cutting production rates too low, it forces the industry, the big four in France, Thales, Dassault, Airbus, and Safran, to fund, to financially support small and medium enterprises. And the second highlight, indeed, more technological. It's about developing aircraft that will dramatically cut their CO2 emissions. Two major targets are an A320 successor that would be relatively conventional, that would use ultra-high bypass ratio turbofans, and that would be for the early 2030s. And in parallel, and to be honest, it still has to be clarified, but it's still a major shift, a major binding goal that the government has set to Airbus. It's developing hydrogen-powered commercial aircraft. So this will probably start with a small regional aircraft and maybe a larger regional aircraft, and eventually something like an A320, I think the size of an A320, maybe certainly not the first step in moving to hydrogen. But it seems that France and a few days later, other European organizations are moving to hydrogen, are really focusing on hydrogen, choosing hydrogen as the energy, maybe not source, but energy vector of the future.
Hydrogen-powered aircraft. What happened to electric propulsion?
Good question. It still has a role. It will certainly still has a role, notably for regional aircraft. But it seems batteries have sort of lost momentum in their race against hydrogen. So there is still a lot of development going on. But for example, Airbus and Rolls-Royce have dropped, I think it was in April, they dropped the eFan-X project. They terminated it. It was all about hybrid electric propulsion. So I think hybrid electric is not dead. There is still research going on, but it seems hydrogen is taking or is about to take the edge.
Okay, well, let's cross the pond to Guy in California, who's our propulsion expert. Guy, is hybrid electric starting to slip, and is hydrogen really coming on as a stronger alternative? It seems very sudden to me, this talk.
Well, I mean, yeah. Good evening, good morning, and good afternoon from the West Coast. Well, the strange thing is, of course, hydrogen is not new. You know, we've been studying it as an option since I remember when one of my first jobs in aviation journalism was to write about a Russian project, which was hydrogen, a tank on top of a Tupolev 154, a modified program. And as you can tell, I'm no spring chicken, so that was obviously quite a while ago in the 1980s. So it has been studied for a while. So what's different now is that there's a sort of assumption that there's more than one way of of skinning the cat. To reach the reduction in greenhouse gases, the goals that have been that are want to have been set by the governments, and particularly aviation's contribution to it by the mid 2050s. They have to take action across the board. So hybrid electric technology will be part of this. It's just that now we've seen this sort of potential for a more dramatic early cut with this, sort of really focusing in on the hydrogen initiative. So synthetic, sustainable alternative fuels will be part of it as well, as you sort of transition to this new raft of technologies. And obviously, given the sort of serious gravimetric and volumetric power density challenges of both electric and hydrogen for the required weights and ranges of the long-haul aircraft that we're looking at, and the battery density sort of governed likelihood of electric power solutions for small regional aircraft, it looks like the real sweet spot for this sort of regional, the sort of hydrogen aircraft, if you like, is going to be all the way from regional and single aisles to that sort of middle of the market sector. That's going to be the real battleground where you're going to see this hydrogen versus hybrid electric. So hybrid electric isn't dead. It's just going to be part of the solution, and it depends where you are in the size of these aircraft.
Yeah. Thierry, the French government has said 2035. When we'd been talking about sustainable aircraft, some of the talk was a little later than that. Is the government basically pushing industry and Airbus to move faster on clean aircraft?
I would say so. I would also like to hear Jens about this. My take is that it is an acceleration. 2035 was already mentioned in the past for a net neutral or hydrogen-powered aircraft. Indeed, but as far as I remember, it was mentioned as consistent with the 2050 goals, sustainability goals, but it was mentioned by the Clean Sky Joint Undertaking. In other words, joint organization at the European level, a private-public partnership, but it was not mentioned by Airbus CEO, for example. So my take is that yes, it is an acceleration that is being required by the French government, and yes, it would be difficult for Airbus to say, well, actually they are starting to say this. They are slightly downplaying the fact that the goal for entry into service in 2035 is binding. They are downplaying it, saying things like, well, we are talking about demonstrators, yes, for an entry into service in 2035, but we've committed to a demonstrator. But well, they would probably have a hard time dropping any project because the public pressure on Airbus is huge. So long story short, I would say yes, it's an acceleration that is being required. Would Jens like to comment?
Yeah.
Yes, I'm trying to. I'm trying to. In a way, it is. I think, and Faurie explained that to me in the interview. It is an acceleration in the sense that they are now in the position financially to try and test, different avenues at the same time, whereas before they were, looking at it in sequence just because of resources. But now this help package by the French government and also by the German government, it puts them into a better position to speed this up, to look at various options in parallel. And obviously that that can very likely result in an acceleration. Also, you mentioned the 2050 target. Airbus has clearly now said, Faurie has said this in the interview, that in order to meet that target in 2050, they need to have an aircraft like that, way before that. So like in the mid 2030s, just because you will have a lot of old aircraft flying that will never be able to get to the kind of efficiency levels that you need for it. So you need a much better aircraft in the mix much earlier.
So yes, it's interesting. When this COVID-19 crisis began, conventional wisdom was that it would set back sustainability efforts because everyone turned their focus to survival. but it seems like it might in the long run end up accelerating aviation's adaptation of more sustainable platforms. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, absolutely. I would say that. I mean, it's beyond aircraft manufacturers and aircraft development. If you look at the airline, the in-service side of the business, lots of governments are now mandating environmental targets as part of the bailouts, right? You know, they're giving airlines a lot of money, but they are saying that you know, you need to meet certain efficiency targets. And some countries like Austria over here in Europe, they are implementing, you know, minimum ticket prices that are that are supposed to prevent, you know, short-haul flying completely. So yeah, long answer, absolutely yes.
Let's pull it in a little closer. We're starting to get some questions in from our audience. Thank you, and keep them coming. Guy, I think this one's best for you. It's about the Pratt & Whitney GTF, geared turbofan engine, and the narrow body market. And it's saying, you know, what is the impact of the GTF on Airbus and Boeing? Obviously, the GTF is an option on the A320neo. It is not on Boeing aircraft currently, but some people are wondering, would Boeing consider it for whatever follows the 737? You want to comment on that?
Well, yeah, I mean, in a way, of course, it's difficult to remember now, but the introduction of the geared turbofan by Pratt & Whitney is really a big part of why we're having a lot of this conversation. You know, it was launched for the C series. It was a potential, you know, it was an advantage. Well, of course, you know, from that perspective of adapting a turbofan with a gear and a larger scale than had been done before, it introduced an immediate competitive advantage from that aspect. Of course, established players like CFM have been able to match it with, you know, advancing the technology of conventional direct drive turbofans. But the point is that it began to accelerate a process which resulted in the development of the Neo and the Max. And it began really to kickstart this sort of advance across the board. Now, of course, we've seen Rolls-Royce adapt geared technology for the UltraFan, having recognized that it was a way of advancing propulsive efficiency at the same time as being able to work on core technologies to advance thermal efficiency. So it has had and will continue to have a dramatic effect. The big question now, of course, is what is the evolution of the geared turbofan? Will it actually will it follow, like the other turbine technologies, along this hydrogen or electric path? And I think the answer is it is adaptable to both directions. At the moment, of course, because the hybrid electric initiative is perhaps further along in some cases, NASA is working with Pratt & Whitney on some early research concepts for an embedded generator in a geared turbofan in a GTF as part of the next generation work. We don't know that much outside yet about this work, but obviously it is part of the overall initiative for more electric systems on aircraft. So you have another leverage there. But of course, longer term, you know, given the fact that Airbus is now really pivoting to this hydrogen initiative, the other question is, can you adapt conventional gas turbines or geared turbofans to run with hydrogen as a fuel directly injected into the combustor adapted system, or even as part of a system in which you're looking at a fuel cell where the hydrogen is actually operating the fuel cell in the engine, in the propulsion system, and you're using that power then to drive the fan. So from that perspective, I think any geared system has a long runway ahead of it, because it can be adapted and, you know, use both electrical and new fuel systems like hydrogen ultimately.
Let's talk a little bit about the market dynamics. I think we start with Jens and then go back to you, Guy. But Obviously, Airbus was out of the gate first with the Neo. Boeing followed later with the Max, and Airbus had a commanding lead, but Boeing always said we'll catch up. They haven't caught up, and in fact, Airbus has widened its lead because at the upper end of that market, the A321 Neo family has just been so popular with the market. Jens, is this a permanent shift in the market dynamics in favor of Airbus over Boeing, or a long-term shift?
I mean, I don't know about permanent. I do think it is a long-term effect. And if you go back to that poll, the first one we've put up here, I'm in the at least in the 10-year camp here. The general market trends seem to be favoring the A321 Neo, the LR, the XLR, which have been beating the Max versions in that space even before the grounding and before COVID. And if you look at how air travel might recover, long haul routes, people will try to use small aircraft in the long haul routes. And there you go. The A321 XLR will come into play in 2023, maybe just about the right time. So yes, I do think that solidifies Airbus's position. Likewise, on the lower end of the market, the A220, you can see again and again how valuable, how good that deal was for Airbus right now, because I mean there are no deals right now, of course, but when there are deals again, they can mix A220 orders with A320 Neo orders, and we've seen that in the past year or two already. And then strategically, when you look at replacing A320, the A320 Neo family, you already have a good aircraft in the lowest end of that market, the A220. So Airbus is a lot more flexible and has to cover a smaller piece of the market with an aircraft that it builds then, which is obviously a big advantage vis-a-vis Boeing.
Guy, what's the Boeing view on all that?
There's a couple of really interesting things actually. One is, of course, you can't really do an apples to apples comparison in some ways, because Airbus and Boeing, weirdly, of course, across the board are quite different in many ways. Of course, Boeing has its defense and space arms, which represents around 30% of its turnover. And from its production perspective on its commercial side, there's quite a few differentiators. Of course, Boeing's got a really strong freighter lineup, which even if you're seeing a sort of a challenge on the single aisle side as it gets back on its feet with the Max, Boeing does have a lot of other sort of arrows in its quiver, the 767 rate is going up, the 787 continues across the production on the 8910, and Boeing, of course, considers that to be just as the A321 might be considered the right aircraft for the rebirth of the market after COVID. They see the 787 family in very much the same way because of the long haul, thin route perspective that they have with that aircraft. It's a really competitive product on that side, without a doubt. And of course, at the very big end, ultimately, 777X is entering, or will be entering service when the market's at its weakest. But don't forget, the 777 has just celebrated 25 years. This is a long game, and the 777X, they think really, when deliveries really get going, not next year, of course it will initially enter service next year. It's really when 2022, 23, when the market recovery is really getting into its stride, that they think, the time will be right for it. And of course, competitively, as we've just heard, the A380, it's really, COVID's been sadly really the death knell for that. And it coincides with the mass retirement of so many of the larger fleets, particularly the 747-400s. So there will be ultimately a need for a very, very efficient twin engine solution at that very large size. So although things look a bit rough right now, I think Boeing's perspective is is they have to stay the course, and that they will have a pretty good product lineup for when that recovery comes. And I think the last thing to say is obviously on the MAX. Well, you know, what more can you say at the moment about this? But their number one priority remains get that back into service. They know they've got a huge amount of inventory, which they have to get back into the market. And as that is willing and ready to accept that, then that'll regenerate cash back into the company so cash generation can restart. So, sorry, Joe, go ahead.
No, that sounds good. But we have a viewer wants to know from you. I mean, how does Boeing respond to what Jens laid out, the A321neo XLR, which some people view as a killer app? I mean, how's Boeing gonna counter that?
Well, I mean, if you look at, well, of course, Boeing's always said that if you look at the vast majority of aircraft, they know that they don't have anything which is why the whole NMA study was redirected latterly and at the very beginning of this year, although it seems forever ago now, towards a more pointed response, really, sort of a reborn 757, really, if you like, back towards that particular market niche. But all along, they've said that the MAX family, particularly the 9 and 10, in terms of the actual number of operations you see across those long-range routes, that actual market size isn't that huge. It's the aircraft capacity to be able to have a large single-aisle aircraft with that size of capacity. And they say that there's still a huge chunk of the market which they think the MAX could still and does address with the 910. But they know that they don't have a direct response available yet. And I think in a way, as they're rebuilding the MAX, they're just going to have to suck that bit up, you know, and concede that they don't have it. And if you look at the overall impact of you know, the pandemic and of course the MAX, it's obviously pushed all new developments off to the right. And this is going to be part of that. You know, everybody's taking a step back, figuring out what the best response is, and just don't look for anything soon out of Boeing when it comes to new product announcements. The main thing, I think, is a huge sigh of relief up there that they didn't launch the NMA, and it's basically, you know, they're considering that a godsend from some respects. And there's one last thing, which I think is very interesting too, is that internally within Boeing, there's a lot of skepticism about why the French government has backed this hydrogen initiative. The talk within the company is that it's an excuse to bail Airbus out in the name of sustainability. Now, you know, I can see why there is skepticism, of course, from the Boeing perspective. And I want to really talk to Thierry and Jens about what they think about this. But I think this is not it's not an excuse, and I think it should be a threat that should be taken extremely seriously.
Okay, gotcha. Well, Guy, we have a question for you and Thierry, a technical one. We have a viewer that's a little skeptical about all this. It says, isn't there a fundamental energy density issue that needs to be overcome? The reality is fossil fuels pack a huge energy punch with a low weight penalty. Does one of you want to take that?
Yeah, Thierry, you've just written, haven't you, that story?
There's a fundamental energy density issue that needs to be overcome for this to be successful.
Happy to take it. Yes, indeed. That's a huge challenge. There is reasonable hope expressed, among others, by McKinsey, the consultancy McKinsey. Reasonable hope that these challenges, especially in power density, can be overcome over the next years, over the next 5, 7, 8 years in terms of R&D. For the smaller commercial aircraft, such as commuters, regional aircraft, but indeed, the report by McKinsey refers to synthetic fuel, so that also known as power to liquid. So the idea is to capture CO2 and combine it with water using renewable energy to create fuel that is very close to what we know today, to fossil fuels. And that would be more convenient probably for at least the next 10 to 15 years, maybe more. This would be more convenient for wide-body long-haul aircraft. So indeed, the power density issue is far from solved, far from overcome for the larger aircraft, indeed. But again, there is competition between the two allies, if you wish, of hybrid electric and hydrogen. Both of them have their issues. Both of them have their power density issues. And well, there seems to be a rally in Europe around hydrogen.
Yeah, and just to that's right, Thierry. I was going to say, just to add to it, one of the intriguing things is that, and that Airbus is looking at, and this is just to get your head around what they're talking about here. The current studies that they're looking at would envisage, for example, an A321 size fuselage with a hydrogen tank capability built into that, because you're right, you can't get around physics. There is a difference in energy and volumetric density. So an A321 size fuselage carrying an A320 size cabin in terms of capacity, that's the sort of delta. So an A320 would carry an A319 size passenger complement, and you can see how that would work. The great thing about this approach is that because of the greater efficiency, you could get away with flying an A321 size airplane around and still make money with an A320 capacity, and at the same time you would have virtually zero carbon emissions. And the bottom line is, if you're an aircraft maker in mid 2030s and you say we can give you a zero emissions aircraft, you're a winner. So, and if you have that in your product line and the other guys don't, then good luck trying to sell that in the green world of 2030s, because that is going to be a game changer. So anyway, just to recap a little bit on that, Airbus has said that, and Thierry and Jens know this, that their plan is to really look at, by 2025, their early research, they want to have made a few choices in terms of how this technology is going to be addressed. So if that is the case by 2025, they will know how to plan out their flight demonstrators that Thierry mentioned and Jens. And this will give them 2 or 3 years to do active flight demos, ground tests, and flight tests, which would allow them to launch by the end of the decade, a new product, which, given that timescale, could and would be targeted at entry into service at 2035. And looking at the key part of the research there is to address, for example, the gravimetric energy density of fuel, aviation fuel, is 12 kilowatt hours per kilogram. The potential for liquid hydrogen is around 33 kilowatt per kilograms. But of course, the volumetric energy density is the issue, as one of the viewers has kind of noted. So 10.4 kilowatt hours per liter is what you get with fuel, whereas with liquid hydrogen it's only 2.4. And I think so. The other thing they've got to look at is, how do you combine this? It's not just a question of saying, here's a lot of liquid hydrogen. You can also look at this by having hydrogen-powered other systems on the aircraft. You could have a hydrogen that would be helping the fuel cell, which would then generate electricity to replace the APU and the other aircraft systems. Or you could drive electric fans, as we've said, with hydrogen-produced electricity through fuel cells. So, or you could combine that, with other ways. So there's a potential for several different ways of tackling this.
Okay. Well, believe it or not, we're well past the halfway mark, so I think it's a good time to go to poll question number 2 for our audience. Number 2, what will have the biggest impact on what will have the biggest impact on development of sustainable airliners? Select one of the following: alternative fuels, biofuels, hybrid electric, clean hydrogen, or all of the above. So let's see what our audience thinks about this clean hydrogen. Give us a moment and we will display the results. And here we go. All of the above, 48%. And it's pretty evenly divided between the other three. Jens Flotow, you're here with us. Did you want to weigh in? I believe you're back in Frankfurt.
I hope I'm back, and I hope you can hear me. I'm in the all of the above camp. I mean, it's a question of sequencing, right? You will have to go for biofuels in the first few years, definitely. And then the questions out there as to what avenue is being taken. Coming back to one point that Thierry made and Guy also about the schedule, Faury said in 2025 they want to be where they can, at a point where they can decide which direction they will take. And then they will prepare the launch of an actual aircraft program, which will then take place in 27 or 28. So it's not far out there. It's very, very soon. And coming back to the competitive dynamic between Airbus and Boeing, this is a new element here that we haven't really been aware of that much until quite recently. But it's there now, and it's coming, and it's changing a lot, in my view.
Okay. And doesn't Boeing have to respond? I mean, if Airbus starts to make progress on this, Boeing can't just sit back, right?
No, you're right. It can't. And so what we've seen, and this goes back to what we were saying earlier about the impact of the pandemic on all of these new technologies, and what you were saying, Joe, about it seems to have been an accelerator. So just before this, like a year ago, everybody was saying, well, hang on, our next replacement for Max and Neo is going to be in the late 2020s, because and that was too soon for a lot of these technologies, whether it was hydrogen or hybrid electric, to really make a substantial difference in single aisles. It was within the timescale for small regional maybes, and it still is. But now, of course, it looks like everybody's timescale has been shifted back towards the end of the decade, if not early in the 30s. And all of a sudden, you're now seeing hydrogen and hybrid electric and all of these potential technologies starting to make sense on a TRL, technology readiness level, where they could be acceptable for a mainline introduction. Now, over in the US, of course, Boeing has worked closely, over the years with NASA as a leader in the sort of bringing together a lot of the research initiatives along for propulsion and airframe and structures and so forth. And a lot of the focus here has been on what to go for next in terms of the X-planes. NASA's X-planes are a great way of demonstrating a lot of this technology. And it's a lot of the way that sort of Europe's Clean Sky has sort of begun to be competitive with by doing the same thing. So NASA's next priority is, well, where do we go with this X-plane philosophy? Because the next one is going to be the one that perhaps makes all the difference from the US's perspective on certainly Boeing's perspective. And the thing that they're looking at now, and NASA has literally just this last week been talking about, is that transonic truss-braced wing design that we've certainly talked about in Aviation Week quite a lot. Now, you can quite clearly see that aerodynamically, it's very optimized for a new level of efficiency in terms of aerodynamic and structural efficiency. It also gives you the option for propulsive changes, a propulsive efficiency, and it's irrespective of how that occurs. So you can have there's enough room for high bypass engines of a much larger scale than you've ever had before on a single aisle airplane. And how you drive that, whether it's hybrid electrically or with hydrogen, it's still open in my view anyway, in that ballpark. So, and another thing that that Jens was saying in terms of that timescale, part of the technology drive in terms of the timetable that Airbus is looking at is how do you make a hydrogen fuel system A, feasible, and B, safe? Because we all, everybody remembers that hydrogen is still incredibly difficult material to work with. But Airbus has been saying, well, look, we've spent the last 70 years almost working out the safety and systems for fuel, for kerosene-based fuel, and we know how to do this. And it's just a different fuel. We know how to do this, and that's part of the evaluation. The second thing is that as you look towards that timescale, what would be the next big thing? And the other thing is, where do you make that fuel? With hydrogen, you can actually make fuel at the airport. You can actually have a fuel farm that will generate its own hydrogen behind the long-term parking lot, And so a lot of this is going to be about the infrastructure of how you do it. And Airbus, one of the things Airbus wants to do is talk to people like SAS in Scandinavia, which has been a huge driver for this, and sort of say things like, okay, we'll start off small. We know that fuel is going to be an issue. Let's see if we can work with you, put hydrogen fuel stores in one airport in, say, Gothenburg or somewhere in Sweden or Norway, and operate a network where aircraft will fuel there, go to a destination and return, and they will never have to fuel outside of that network. That would be the beginnings of it. But you can begin to see how this hydrogen infrastructure will grow, So anyway, those are just a few thoughts.
So Thierry, what are some of the key technologies Airbus is working on to try to gain a competitive advantage?
Sorry about that. There are two short-term technologies I think may give an edge to Airbus. One is EVS, Enhanced Vision Systems, that are well known in business aviation. And the idea is basically to use infrared to see through fog. The second one that goes actually in the same direction, and I will explain that, is the autonomous takeoff, taxiing, and landing system that Airbus has been trying on an A350. Quite successfully. The idea is to use a camera and artificial intelligence to perform image recognition and to land, for example, just by recognizing the lines of the runway. And both technologies go into the direction of more independence, more autonomy from ground landing aids. In both cases, the idea is to rely less on ILS or other ground aids. And my point is that first, both technologies can be very attractive to airlines in developing countries, which don't necessarily have a large network of airports with high-level ground aids, such as ILS level 3, category 3. And so first thing, this can be very attractive to developing countries. And my other point is that the second technology, ATOL, the autonomy one, is a first step towards autonomy. And a number of airlines are would very much like to employ fewer pilots. So there's still a lot of debate going on about introducing more autonomy into aircraft, about cutting the number of pilots in the cockpit. But, well, that would be a first step that could make some carriers familiar with more autonomy. And again, that could give Airbus an edge.
Jens, we're Aviation Week, so we love to talk about future technologies, hydrogen, that sort of thing, but it seems we're testing the patience of at least one of our viewers. They said, hey, you were talking about Airbus's immediate challenges. So can we get back to what are the challenges they face? Market deferments, cancellations, labor force reductions, supply chain, dealing with the supply chain. Do you want to give us a little bit of an update on their immediate crisis and how they're dealing with it and what we should expect?
Yeah, sure. I think that the real challenge here is that you have everything at the same time, and you have to come up with some kind of solution that addresses all of this. Their solution seems to be that they want to at all costs stay at that rate 40 for the narrow bodies per month, 40 aircraft per month. That is probably more than what airlines and lessors would like to take. It's probably also the minimum that the supply chain can go down to without severe or even more severe financial issues that they may then face. So it's really the combination of all of this, plus the guesswork about how long will you have to sustain this. The idea they have is, of course, 2020 is terrible. 2021 will be equally terrible, and then parts of their portfolio will see a pickup in demand again. Obviously, narrow bodies first. Actually, Fourie mentioned to me that he thinks it's quite possible that the return will be quite steep. So they have to prepare that as well. You cannot cut too deeply because you will risk being unable to respond to that rebound in due course. And then there's really open questions like the A330neo. One of the viewers asked about A330neo, A350 outlook. My personal take: A330neo is a really good aircraft. It just came at the wrong time. The crisis hit. The A330ceo in service fleet is very young and still very efficient, so that many airlines cannot replace it. A350, I guess the 900 is great, is well positioned even in this crisis or just immediately after this crisis. The 1000 may face kind of the same issues that Boeing has on the 777X. It may be a good aircraft, yes, for sure, but it may be very big for what the market requires.
I know, Jens, you and I both received briefings from Aviation Week's Kappa in Operation Australia. They developed a new airline route forecasting tool that they're going to debut, and boy, the international portion of that was just dismal. But I wanted to give a Guy a chance to respond about how Boeing, answered that question for Jens for Boeing.
Yeah, well, absolutely. Obviously the MAX, as we mentioned, is probably the key thing at the moment. The number one priority is getting it back into service, and I think August, September is now the more realistic window. That it's obviously taking longer because of the issue with certification and agreeing on that basis, and the logistics of getting all that testing done. So they've also got lots of inventory to deliver, as we mentioned, and that's really why you've seen this another issue out to their suppliers to slow things down again, because remember the supply base was still building at the larger rate at 52 plus before the slowdown had occurred, even as Boeing reduced to 42 before it shut down at the end of the year. So there was a gradual increase in inventory, which now has overtaken them. So anyway, so that's so once the feeling inside the company is that finally sort of the return to service is within sight at least, and they know they've obviously dug themselves a massive hole from which to get out of, but they know that they feel like they're getting up to the lip of that crater sort of thing. But obviously even when they get out of it, there's still a lot to go, a long way to go, particularly with getting resynchronized with the supply chain and getting that towards that tempo of 31 or thereabouts a month by sometime next year, late next year. The other issues really are then to deal with, where their deliveries will be taking place to the reliance, for example, on the single aisle with low-cost carriers. The feeling is that they may not be as exposed as Airbus to that, although they are heavily exposed. So there's a wait and see sort of attitude with that. They're trying to say that they're not playing as hardball as Airbus are with some of their customers, as we've seen with obviously Albaca, as Jens mentioned. But you know, that's going to play out over the next few months as the operators and users gradually recover. So then the onwards beyond that, again, it's kind of dusting off the production ramp-up plans. The 777 combined rate for the 300ER, the freighter, which is actually quite buoyant, relatively speaking, and the X. Between the three of them, as the 300ER bows out and the X ramps up, that's going to be leveling off at around 3 per month next year. The 787, as we've already heard, that's going to be cut back. It's going to be cut back from 10 per month later this year to 7 a month by 2022. So they gradually see that sort of bottoming out. But there is the ability to bring some of that back up, and that's another advantage they see. You know, they've only got the 2 sites for wide bodies, whereas, you know, Airbus, of course, by its nature, is federated across 4 main production final assembly sites, with all of the complications that brings in terms of priorities, politics, and so forth. So they see their ability to respond potentially is better. That's their opinion. 777X, of course, we've mentioned. I think the only other thing beyond that is, when do we start looking at the next new product? And there's been lots of studies, but I think this hydrogen initiative has really potentially, you know, when they look at it, it's going to throw the cat among the pigeons.
What about, we had a question from a viewer guy about supersonic. You wrote the cover story in next week's Aviation Week magazine about Boom's supersonic project to develop a sustainable supersonic airliner, 75 passenger airliner. But is supersonic a path Boeing could choose to go down to try to blunt Airbus's competitiveness?
Yeah, I mean, to be fair, Boeing, don't forget, is involved in the Ariane project, the AS2.
The business jet.
The business jet, exactly. But Ariane has, you know, announced, or at least it's revealed, ambitions to develop a family which would include an airliner, which Boeing would, of course, if it remains a partner, would be heavily involved with. Spirit Aerosystems is a major structural partner. So Boeing is definitely involved, at least at the grassroots level at the moment on that. I mean, obviously, I think it's part of this general take stock of where we are and get real at the moment with reality of survival. But longer term, absolutely, they do want to increase their penetration into high-speed travel. I mean, you know, they've even talked about hypersonic commercial transport for later in this century. So their ambition is definitely defined in that regard. And I think, you know, if they can see a path forward to a sustainable supersonic transport, then yeah, you betcha, yeah, they will definitely go for it. But it's a longer term thing, and I think the main thing is really to survive and to get through to the next decade with a whole raft of products that are going to be able to take part of this new power economy, you know.
We are almost out of time, so why don't we go to our audience for the third and final poll question. What should be Airbus's next product move? Develop a successor to the A320neo family, develop a new wide body, or do nothing and wait for Boeing's next move? So let's give you all a moment to vote on this last poll question. And when we see the answers, Jens, I'd like to hear what you think. Give the audience just a few more seconds to vote, and we'll show you what you all think. Okay, wow, 61% say Airbus should develop a clean sheet successor to the 320 family. 30%, sizable number, say don't do anything. let Boeing go first, and only 9% think a wide body should be the priority. What do you think about those answers, Jens?
Well, I think there's a lot of French government officials in the audience, given the recent support package. No, but I think that's exactly it. I mean, without that, I would say just don't do anything, wait and see what Boeing does. But obviously, the picture has changed. If not for political reasons, if anything, but for political reasons. And if they're going to spend the money, obviously, A320neo family replacement is the way to go.
Okay, Thierry, do you see things the same way, Jens?
Yes, I would phrase it slightly differently, but basically, yes, I fully agree. My point would be they should do incremental improvements on all of their products. I mentioned the autonomy and the EVS, and they should at the same time develop a successor to the A320, focusing on, well, they will have to make a choice very soon, focusing on sustainability, focusing on either burning much less conventional fuel or moving to another fuel or hybrid electric, or maybe both in parallel. So we will probably know over the next couple of years.
Okay. Well, unfortunately, we are just about out of time. I want to, Jens, Thierry, Guy, thank you all for a fantastic conversation, as always, and we'll all be back. But for this week, that's a wrap for our webinar, which is being recorded and will be available online for viewing in 24 hours. We will not have a webinar next Friday because of the Independence Day holiday in the US. We also won't have a Farnborough Air Show next month, but we're not going anywhere. So starting July 10th, look for 2 weeks of webinars, in-depth articles, podcasts, and detailed interviews with the CEOs of Airbus, Boeing, Raytheon Technologies, Lufthansa Technik, and other companies. Go to aviationweek.com/AD2020 for a complete schedule. Special thanks to our webinar production team in London, Rupa Haria, Rebecca Badcock, and Bridget Tarek. Have a wonderful weekend, everybody, and stay safe.
Thank you.